My name is Joy. My name is Joy James. I'm a professor at Williams College. We're delighted to have a very active and very intellectually rich and politically committed roundtable today, as we have, of course, for all three roundtables over this semester. And before I go further, I want to first give the land acknowledgement that is also posted on the Williams College Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I would like to say, following that land acknowledgement, to share our thanks to the Mystic Seaport Museum, as well as Williams Mystic, Brown University, also, which are partners, and Brown University has led, right, in the creation of the Just Futures Mellon Grant that we're all participating in, and that this roundtable series is a part of, based at Williams College. In addition, we appreciate the support of Oakley Center and the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Our thanks to Michael Mann and Michelle Dempsey for their support, as well as our colleagues Christine DeLucia, Ngoni Nemo, and Tom Van Winkle. I want to say, before I turn to introducing our speakers and reading their bios that they've provided, as well as the titles and the abstracts of their brief talks today, which will be the basis of dynamic dialogue among them before we open for questions to everyone. I also want perhaps not to problematize, but to contribute a query to these endeavors of Entwined. Perhaps in addition to a land acknowledgement, we might develop a labor acknowledgement, given that the indigenous were enslaved, as were Africans, on these shores, and that the creation of these institutions that we occupy as colleges and universities, where we're privileged to teach and to learn with our students, that these institutions would recognize the dual contradictions of land removal and also labor extraction, and the ways to make restitution that would constitute some forms of freedom. Now to our speakers. We have 4 speakers today. And again, I'm really interested in their dialogue with us collectively and their dialogue among themselves. The first is Anthony Bogues with Brown University, and Anthony Bogues, Professor Bogues, was the primary engineer in allowing this grant to take place. Anthony Bogues is a writer, scholar, and curator. He has published 9 books in the fields of Black radical political thought, Caribbean intellectual history, and Caribbean art. He is currently working on a book titled Black Critique and a project on the political thought of Michael Manley and Jamaica in the 1970s. He is also co-editing some of the unpublished writings of Sylvia Wynter and writing a volume on Haitian art. He has curated art shows in the Caribbean, South Africa, and the US. Bogues is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory at Brown University, the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown, an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town, and a visiting professor of African and African diasporic thought at the Free University of Amsterdam. The title of his presentation today is History, Settler Colonialism, and the Present. Professor Bogues will be arguing that settler colonialism is the historical ground of American imperial power that is both internal and external. Bogues will briefly suggest that in the contemporary moment, the drive of power is to reconstruct an American society that is grounded in the ideological echoes of that settler ground. Our next speaker will be Barbara Krauthamer from UMass Amherst. Professor Krauthamer is Dean of the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at UMass Amherst, where she's also professor of history. She's the author of multiple books, including Black Slaves, Indian Masters, subtitled Slavery, Emancipation, and Citizenship in the Native American South, as well as the other text, which is Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, which is co-authored with Dr. Deborah Willis. The latter book traced the history of emancipation and freedom through a study of over 150 historic photographs and received the 2013 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work in Nonfiction. The professor is currently working on two books. The first is Liberty's Diaspora, which tells the story of the thousands of enslaved African-American women, men, and children who escaped to the British during the American Revolution. The second book is The Black Women Who Built America. This book offers a visual history of African and African-American women's lives from the era of the American Revolution through the Civil War. In 2017, Professor Krauthamer received the Lorraine A. Williams Leadership Award from the Association of Black Women Historians and recognition of both her scholarship and her work to create opportunities for Black women in higher education. She's held numerous leadership positions in professional and community organizations. She's currently serving as she currently serves on the Massachusetts Women's Network of the American Council on Education and was recently appointed to serve on the Massachusetts Commission on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. The title of her talk is Slavery, Freedom, and Sovereignty in the 19th Century. This talk addresses the issue of African and African-American enslavement in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations in the 18th and 19th centuries. It will trace this history to highlight the gender dynamics of enslavement for both African-Americans and their Native American enslavers. Here, Krauthamer addresses the complexities and challenges of history, the complexities of balancing Native histories of Indigenous gender roles, documents authored by white missionaries, and Black people's, especially women's, accounts of their enslavement. Her talk highlights the inherent tensions of placing this particular history of Southern slavery, that's in quotation marks, in the context of the violent US campaign of dispossession and efforts to eradicate Native sovereignty. Krauthamer concludes with a consideration of what freedom, again in quotes, meant for Black people in the Native nations after the end of the Civil War and abolition of chattel slavery in the US. And she points to the parallels between the past and the present day struggles for meaningful freedom and citizenship for both Black and Native peoples. Our third presenter is Professor Kyle Mays from UCLA. Kyle T. Mays, he, him pronouns, is an Afro-Indigenous Saginaw Chippewa writer and scholar of US history, urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture, an assistant professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, which is subtitled Modernity and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America, which came out in 2018, and Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, which came out last year. And this year, the new publication, City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit. The title of his talk is Afro-Indigenous Solidarity Against Settler Colonialism and White Supremacy and Lessons from the Post-1960s. Mays raises two questions. First, what is the relationship between Black power and Red power in ideology and practice? And the second query is, how can we build a world on the way to the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy, and what role can expressive culture play? Building upon Mays's and Afro-Indigenous history of the US, Mays continues to explore the history of Black and Indigenous relations in the US with a specific focus on the Black and Red Power era of the 1960s and 1970s as he analyzes the links between Blackness, indigeneity, and contemporary popular culture. And our last speaker, Jasmine Syedullah from Vassar, a transdisciplinary Black feminist theorist and scholar of abolitionist movements. Jasmine Syedullah is co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. A faculty member of Vassar College, she advises the college prison studies curriculum and its programming. Her current book project centers the truant emancipation and, quote, timecraft of Harriet Jacobs' 1861 abolitionist narrative, end quote, as a proto-feminist foundation for critical carceral race and gender studies. Syedullah practiced with Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who is sensei at the Center for Transformative Change. And Syedullah has taught at the University of San Francisco, as well as the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she completed her PhD in politics, feminist studies, and the history of consciousness program. Affectionately known as Dr. Sai, I hope I got that pronunciation correct. She serves as a certified yoga teacher, a mindfulness instructor, and skilled facilitator on the abolitionist strategies and contemplative institutional change. Her research writing appears in the journals Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics, the Journal of Contemporary Political Theory, Society in Space, Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, and Truth Out. The title of her talk will be Embracing Freedom While Reckoning with Racial Violence, a Black feminist discipline of care. And here in this talk, Syedullah asks, how do commonplace everyday expressions of care wear down our resistance to well-being and break the hold of colonial, capitalist, and carceral logics on our imaginations of freedom? How do we learn to see our whole lives without the fluorescent illuminations of corrections, welfare, and other state-sanctioned politics of racialized recognition that render Black lives immaterial? In order to chart trajectories of progress, Syedullah argues in their talk, we must ask ourselves to bring an embodied discipline of Black feminist care from marooned communities and decolonial movements to confront the tendencies within ourselves, our cultures, and our political systems to practice care as a paternalistic extension of colonial patriarchal power. So that's a lot of gift giving from our panelists, and I will stop here and we'll begin with Professor Bogues.
Thank you very much, Professor James, and thanks very much to the colleagues at Williams College, particularly Professors Christine DeLucia and Ngone, and all the others for organizing these sets of roundtables titled Entwined. I have eight or so minutes, so my remarks will be in thesis staccato form, and then hopefully we can have comments and conversations during the course of this webinar. So thesis one, the arrival of Europeans into the Americas marked the opening of a series of human encounters based on genocide and dispossession. The logic of secular colonialism in the Americas was central to the emergence of a kind of colonial capitalism. Early secular colonialism, therefore, should be understood not just as simply secular colonialism and white supremacy, but as a form of colonial capitalism, based primarily on war, genocide, and dispossession. Thesis two. In the New England region, before the arrival of the African slaves, there were slaves in indentured, both slaves and indentured indigenous people. In 1614, we have reports of indigenous people being taken from New England area and being sold as slaves in England. Secular colonialism, therefore secular colonial capitalism, engage in various forms, not just of therefore genocide and of dispossession, but was also involved in forms of slavery and servitude. The British Atlantic world, therefore, which is part of what the New England area was part of an outpost of British colonial and secular colonial region with Jamaica and Bermuda, Barbados, and other British and indeed Spanish colonial and French colonial territories. Point I'm making here in thesis 2 is that prior to African slavery, there was both indigenous dispossession as well as indigenous slavery, particularly in the New England area. Thesis 3, racial slavery was mapped upon this form of indigenous servitude and slavery. It is clearly seen if one examines the codes of Barbados, codes of racial codes of South Carolina, and the ways in which these particular racial codes in the early 16 and late 1600s began to characterize people, where what happened was that the indigenous people were characterized as heathen, along with Black people, and then Christians were characterized as primarily white people. And by the late 1600s, there were 3 different characterizations in the slave codes of people who were Indian, Blacks, or white. And so therefore, my argument is that racial slavery has to be seen as being mapped upon, not separate from, but actually related to and mapped onto certain forms of slavery and indenture that was happening, particularly in the New England area. Thesis 4, historically genocide and dispossession and racial slavery, therefore, and notice I don't say chattel slavery, racial slavery were generated colonial violence, and that this violence over time was then based on racialized Black bodies. However, the relations between indigenous peoples and Blacks today are sometimes considered in the following way: a relationship of antagonism, a relationship in which the struggles or the different forms of oppression are seen as incommensurate, lack of a certain commonality, or on the other hand, people ask for solidarity, or some people talk about each having their own unique exceptionalism. These particular forms, I would argue, of discussions on overarching frames of the relationships between indigenous and people of African descent are, I would argue, sometimes problematic. Thesis 5. Some scholars working through Edward Glissant, the Caribbean, the Martinican thinker, argue that rather than thinking about unique exceptionalism and solidarity, we should begin to think about questions of relationality. For Glissant in particular, this relationality comes from his book, Poetics of Relation. However, I want to have a different take on this, because Glissant also says that the idea of relation does not actually limit relation, and that the idea of relation does not actually pre-exist, which means that the questions of relationality is something that is always and consistently being worked through. I want to start, therefore, from this position of thinking about relationality, but end at a different destination, a destination of common association. Because as Glissant says, the idea of relationality is not one that pre-exists, it demands work. And because it demands work, I would want to argue, it becomes the work of freedom. Thesis 6, to grasp this relationality, in the words of this particular webinar as Entwined, perhaps 2 things amongst many other things are necessary. Firstly, a certain kind of the history of both groups, indigenous as well as African Americans and racial slavery, but from a perspective of a certain kind of relationality itself. Secondly, a mapping of the relations of domination, relationship between slavery, servitude, and then the relationship around slavery, and to examine them as relations of domination, mapping their relation, yes, but also mapping the historical signs of refusals. And here I'm not talking about just questions of rebellions or war, but trying to map sometimes the everyday and how it is lived, and how in these experiences of the everyday, the quotidian, if you wish, business of freedom is organized and thought about. How is freedom lived? And how does it have a change in character that is not normative, and that is not a kind of normative installation in the way sometimes it is often thought of. So what I'm arguing for is mapping relations of domination between the two, and that is how relations of domination worked in between the two groups, but also talking about the ways in which refusals work inside the two groups, and how those refusals, in fact, can become or are sometimes practices of free zone. Because what one wants to think about is, again, just in terms of relationality, is how this kind of mapping can show us the shapes and influences between each other. But also there's another aspect to this which is important, and that is the aspect of anti-Black racism. And here I'm not talking about overlapping histories, but rather I'm trying to think about forms of domination and how different forms of domination operate, and what are their specific relations in this first in what is colonial capitalism and a secular colony under white supremacy, and then under what some people would call racial capitalism today. We know that racial slavery created an anti-Black racial order. It made Blackness at the bottom of the hierarchical human codes and classificatory schema. We know now that the secular colonialism was Israeli colonial capitalism, and that this is also generative of racial slavery. And therefore, what I would want to suggest is that before the transformation of capitalism into racial capitalism, and I think this is important because it's an argument with a lot of literature today around the question of racial capitalism in America, is that what you had was colonial capitalism, which when once race enters in it almost full time, then what you begin, and anti-Black racism in particular, then you begin to get the business of racial capitalism. And that this is really very important in trying to think through this business of not just America, but I would argue of the indigenous and African in the Americas itself. What that means, I would want to suggest to you, is that America is today a secular colony state, but that is, as a secular colony state, it is also an imperial one. And it is an imperial one on which the material foundations are that today of racial capitalism. Let me explain what I mean by an imperial state and how this imperial state draws internally from the ways in which it has treated and the way it has dominated indigenous people. I want to just make reference to two particular islands and two particular spaces in the Caribbean. One is Puerto Rico and one is Virgin Islands. Both became what is now known in the legal jargon, became dependent states. The idea of the dependent states, in quotation mark, draws from a set of court cases in 1831, as we know, as well as a set of court cases in 1945, the latter between the United States and William Rogers. Both were about what to do with people within some indigenous tribal groups who were defeated, and how they were to be treated by the American secular state. And the idea that was hit upon particularly by Dawes, was this idea, what as he wrote in the Atlantic Monthly, was this idea of the dependent state. And then that dependent state became not just internal, but then was used externally outside of the boundaries of the land territorial boundaries of what became known as the United States to now run Puerto Rico and run the US Virgin Islands when it was bought from the Danish. Thesis 7. I want to return in this thesis to the business of common association. And I would want to argue that one of the central questions, not the, but one of the central questions of our times is really how we live together in difference. That is, how do populations that do not have overlapping histories, but in some ways have common history, how do we rearrange and organize life and politics as a kind of practice of common association to live human life? Because in the final analysis, what faces us, I would want to argue, in the contemporary moment is the quality of human life upon Earth. It's upon what some of us, upon Earth, not the planet, but Earth. And therefore, a kind of life that is not structured around difference, around sets of structured hierarchies, around forms of domination, but rather a set of practices about human life, which are done in what I've called common association, and which would allow common association to be as itself a practice of freedom, not a practice of liberation, nor a practice of emancipation, but actually a practice of freedom itself. And that practice of freedom is absolutely antithetical to the racial capitalist secular colonial state which we now inhabit. To do this, there are many things that need to be done, obviously. And one is not in the business of making a list of things that need to be done. But I would just suggest from where I sit that two things might be necessary as part of the many things that need to be done at this point in time in our history in this country. One of them is about trying to rethink and reimagine the history of the Americas, to understand its secular colonialism, to understand it as part of colonial capitalism, and to understand how it produced certain kinds of violence, and how it's ideologically it produced white supremacy, which then has become the deposit, the ideological deposit in which the right wing actually goes back to reactivate in terms of trying to develop certain kind of politics in this country. Secondly, to begin to talk about how we can explore the various forms of common association that have occurred both in history and in the contemporary moment, but also, quite frankly, to move away from certain kind of ideas about things that are not, around incommensurability, around ideas of solidarity, but rather to think through questions of a certain kind of relationality, of beginning to think about how in living in relations, what does that mean in a particular state, like the imperial state of United States. Those I think are just some of the things that I think may be required in terms of us trying to think about very quickly from a history that has shaped us to what it is that we do in the present. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Bogues. Professor Krauthamer?
Almost forgot to unmute. Thank you, Professor James, Professor DeLucia, and everyone involved with Just Futures for this invitation and opportunity. I was thinking in preparation for this event, how long ago it was that I started my work on African American, Native American intersections in the colonial and 19th century South, and thinking about how much has changed over the years that we can now get together and have these conversations about settler colonialism, about intersecting histories, overlapping histories. It's really a wonderful, wonderful thing. I wanted to talk a little bit briefly this evening about some of my work on the history of African and African American enslavement in Southern Native American nations. Because from my vantage as a historian of African American enslavement, this history, I think, presents a really nicely encapsulated almost case study, if you will, for understanding the complexity of settler colonialism and precisely those kinds of overlapping and intertwined histories of enslavement of African peoples, and a colonial campaign of domination of Native peoples. But then for me, the interesting part is, how did Native peoples and peoples of African descent interact, encounter each other and interact? And one of the first interesting things to remember, of course, in this long history is that until the 1730s, approximately, more Native Americans were captured and enslaved and exported from North America to Caribbean colonies than African captives were brought to North America. So there's also, when we think about that history of slavery and those intersecting histories of Native peoples and African American histories, there's no single set of definitions or no single narrative that neatly encompasses people as enslaved people or free people. But those categories are always unstable, right? Always shifting over time. For me, I'm particularly interested in understanding the complexity of Black life in particular, beyond what, I still think predominates in much of the scholarship as a Black-white binary, and, to the exclusion of Native peoples, or, the flattening of Native peoples to kind of a generic and Native Americans, without taking into full consideration the vast diversity of Native cultures, linguistic groups, regions across North America, for example. So one of the problems that I think continues to plague scholars, that's sort of inescapable, or the nature of the beast of the work that we do with historical research, is how to understand the sources that we're left with. And again, as a historian of African American life and African American women's lives in particular, this is a real challenge, right? Sources from the 18th century, the 19th century, written by Euro-Americans, of course, are fully suffused with and created by the products of a colonial settler regime, both by colonists themselves and then later in the United States, primarily by either missionaries or government authorities who are invested in a regime of domination, both domination of enslaved people of African descent, but also enslaved enslaved people of African descent and Native Americans, in my case, in the southern states. And so trying to tease out the reality of slavery and colonization to uncover, right, the traces of real people's real lives is always challenging, and I think requires a constant, reading through the layers, reading against the grain, if you will. And one of the challenges I think that we can now have a conversation about is how to hold Native American history and African American history in their full complexity and humanity, and how do we hold them together side by side. And I'll give just a couple of examples of this. In the 19th century, white missionaries in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, which I know best, employed owned enslaved laborers and hired enslaved Black laborers from Native American slaveholders to work at mission stations. And the point of the mission stations was to quote unquote, to educate and quote unquote civilize Native American youth. And tensions emerged because wealthier, more powerful, more prominent Native families didn't want their children being being trained in sort of the arts of the dominant society, whether it was gendered labor like spinning and weaving for women, or agricultural labor for boys and men, because that went against traditional Native gender roles in the case of the Choctaws and Chickasaws, but it also put Native children in close proximity to Black laborers. So there's this tension, right, on the one hand of Native peoples not wanting to maintain cultural traditions of their own in the context of gendered labor, and understanding that gendered forms of labor were also racialized in the world of white missionaries, white settlers, and trying to reconcile both of those competing ideas of gender and competing ideas of race and racial hierarchy and racial identity. And, you know, we see it, there's a story in the of a Choctaw enslaver named Harkins, who's killed by an enslaved man named Prince. And depending on whose account you read, right, Prince is either cast as a savage and Harkins' widow, right, is a bereft widow. If you read a missionary account of it, there are Native scholars who, and then in the end, right, Prince takes his own life, and other enslaved people are interrogated and then put to death as accomplices in the murder of Harkins. And some scholars writing about the Native enslavers have said, right, that putting the enslaved people to death was really part of a traditional way of exacting vengeance against enslaved people. But there are other sources that suggest, you know, that these are families who otherwise were ready to break with older Native traditions in how they purchased and acquired enslaved laborers, again, in the gendered division of labor that was imposed on enslaved people, were more inconsistent with Choctaw traditional gender roles. So all of these sort of complexities of trying to understand both Native history on its own terms and African American history, and seeing African American gender roles and that were imposed on Black people through systems of slavery, has been at the core of what my work has done, really in an effort to understand how Black women in particular saw themselves as enslaved people, as laborers, as mothers, as wives, as daughters, as kin, and how they attempted to define themselves and define their freedom after the Civil War. So I will wrap up with just one more thought, which is the history of the Civil War and the history of emancipation in the Native nations, again, sort of presents us with these intertwined competing claims for freedom and for sovereignty. That for Native nations, defending slavery was often part and parcel with defending their sovereignty. And after the Civil War, there's a tension in how freedom is defined, that for some Native leaders, it's defined as the freedom to exclude people of African descent from citizenship in the Native nations where they were enslaved and emancipated. And for African Americans, right, their freedom claims to be included. And that too, that inclusion, exclusion, I think, is the legacy of slavery that we're still struggling with. So I will stop there and look forward to the conversation with the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Mays?
Yes, I'll just go right into it, but I want to say I'm so grateful to be on a panel with esteemed scholars and intellectuals and activists that I've long admired. So I'm just so grateful to be on in a space with you all, even virtually. So I'm just going to do is go through a quick PowerPoint. I put the timer on my Apple Watch so it'll buzz me. So just a few questions. They were basically already approached, but I think there at least one in particular. So I'm talking about the Black and Red Power era, in particular around Black and Native solidarity. But I think a particular one that I always like to highlight is how can we build a world on the way to the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? What role can expressive culture play? And what are these possibilities, again, for kinship in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? So I think it's always important to just mention the people I'm connected with, family history, and so forth. So my great-grandmother, Esther Shaboose Mays, came from the Saginaw Chippewa Reservation to Detroit in the spring of 1940. She married an African-American male, of which she received a lot of hate from the Native community in Detroit for that particular move. And she had these Afro-Indigenous children. She became a well-respected elder around culture and education and activism for youth in particular, and co-founded what was called Detroit's Indian Education and Cultural Center. And she is what I like to describe as an urban Indigenous feminist. And subsequently, my Aunt Judy formed what was called Medicine Bear American Indian Academy in the early 1990s. And it was the third ever public school with a Native American curriculum. And there's still a lot of activists, artists, cultural workers who are still very much appreciative of that school and the work that either my great grandmother did or my Aunt Judy did in the city of Detroit for Detroit's Native community. So settler colonialism, we already have some definitions. What I do like to highlight, and this has been highlighted before, is that the enslavement of Indigenous Africans is a part of that history, right? We sort of often mark those Indigenous peoples as simply African or Black later on, but those are Indigenous peoples having their own language, thoughts, cosmologies, and so forth. And many people approach this, but or at least write about this in some capacity, but it's taken for granted that you have really the collision of these two Indigenous groups exploited and dispossessed in a variety of ways. So typically, in many Black communities, you hear the discussion of the 5 tribes. I always hear this thing sort of many times. And the other one is the Buffalo Soldiers, which is certainly a very complicated discussion and narrative to have. While they are in the aftermath of getting their freedom after the Civil War, there's also this matter of genocide that they are participating in, promoted by the United States government, but they are participating even if they had their own reasoning for doing so. So, but this is kind of the lens through which we often see Black and Indigenous relations. So I want to just quickly get through the Black and Red Power era. So one of the most important, if not the most important writer during this time is Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote Custer Died for the Indian Manifesto in 1968. But this book originally published in 1975. And he said, minority groups are often astounded to learn that the Indians were not planning to share the continent with their oppressed brothers once the revolution was over. Hell no. The Indians were planning on taking the continent back and kicking out all the Black, Chicano, Anglo, and Asian brothers who had made the whole thing possible. And I think this is important to say because solidarity at this particular moment in time, as much as we believe that it is important, was not always inevitable, and it was not something desired necessarily by many Indigenous peoples. And I think this is one person saying this, but I think this was for a majority more of a sentiment than realized, although today I'm going to talk about at least a few exceptions. But this whole notion of land has been central to the African American or people of African descent desire of sovereignty, of freedom, of humanity in some particular way. So, for instance, in 1968, with the Republic of New Africa, I think there's an important discussion historically and today, although some of those things are certainly changing, and this conversation is one of those that's helping. Uh, what do they imagine about returning land to indigenous peoples? Even if they wanted the 5 southern states, how does that perpetuate the dispossession of indigenous peoples who were many largely removed from the area, but some did in fact remain, right? And so this is a discourse of nationalism, sovereignty that can easily and did lead to the erasure of indigenous peoples on a particular land. So are there shared values between the Black Counter Power era? And I won't go through all of these, but I think importantly, a critique of US democracy. Anytime we say indigenous sovereignty and honor the treaties, that is certainly a critique I think is worth mentioning. And returning land is in many ways, if we reconceptualize our conception of land, is about anti-capitalism in some capacity. Now, to the extent that every group share this, of course, that was not every group, but returning land would to indigenous peoples would certainly disrupt in some capacity the notion of US racial capitalism. And Stokely Carmichael, who I highlight here, says all of us must struggle against capitalism. The red man is struggling against capitalism. Certainly he is. He must. He has been a vicious victim of capitalism. It is on his land that the most powerful imperialist system has been built at his very expense. Of course, he must struggle against it, whether he is conscious of it or not. And here's Stokely again, and he's one of the few Black activists during the time period who very explicitly stated that this is indigenous people's land. And I think that's worth pointing out. This is here in 1975 in St. Paul, Minnesota, speaking at a particular rally in support of the American Indian movement. And I think that's a question: what happens when we center land and think about land differently outside of this extractive and exploitative process? A particular moment of solidarity here on the White Earth Reservation in 1981 are certainly a precursor to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when you have Black and Indigenous peoples from North and South America fighting for recognition from the United Nations, right? And I think this is a particular moment at the International Indian Treaty Council here. And I wish there was more scholarship on this particular history, which I think is super important. So about 40 seconds left. And I think one group kind of doing this is the Land Back, the Indian Collective, and their discussion of land back, including Black people, indigenous peoples from Central and South America who have been removed and forced from their homelands, often because the United States' neoliberal policies and influence in that area. And finally, what can some of these things look like? One thing I like about Audre Lorde says, any future vision which can encompass all of us by definition must be complex and expanding, not easy to achieve. And it requires a lot of various forms of solidarity. So anything from eating together to reading together and hanging out, I think are some very important things. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Jasmine Syedullah, Professor Syedullah.
Thank you so much, Joy. It's an honor to be here with this esteemed panel and just getting so much juice from the discussion already. And so, my contribution is coming from a perspective of trying to think about how do we create space in classrooms for the kind of curricular incitement of riot, as Audre Lorde says, and I'll talk about in a second, that actually centers like Indigenous studies as we're doing the work of critical race and ethnic studies. I'm working in an Africana studies program but came out of a student movement in Santa Cruz to create a critical ethnic studies department after a 40-year struggle for ethnic studies in Santa Cruz. And one of the conversations that we continue to have is what is the role of ethnic studies in relationship to Indigenous studies, and the rifts are already there. And so what Professor Bogues was talking about in terms of relationality, and the other panelists as well, is not just a political question, is not just a cultural or sociological or even historical reckoning question, but is also a question of pedagogy. And so beginning to think really expansively about how we occupy classroom space in ways that can disrupt kind of carceral colonial logics of learning and knowledge curation and creation. I was drawn to tap into my own contemplative practices and begin to see how I can use a combination of contemplative practice, embodiment, poetry, music, conversation, and the scholarship of abolitionist movements through time to really begin to invite people to have their whole selves be present in the work that we're doing together in the classroom. And so, I was invited to rethink pedagogy through a lens of abolition and contemplative work, through the work of Stefano Harney and Fred Moten in their piece about the undercommons, when they say it cannot be denied that the university is a place of refuge, and it cannot be accepted that the university is a space of enlightenment. Right? In the face of these conditions, one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can, to abuse its hospitality, to spite its mission, to join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, to be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university. And so I really wanted to expand on this idea and think of it not just as the work of a single individual, but as the work of us as collective communities, potentially, really working across silos, across departmentalities, across disciplinarities, to create a different kind of open. And so actually, I was also invoking Audre Lorde in the poem Coal, where she says, "Love is a word, another kind of open. As a diamond comes into a knot of flame, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Take my word for jewel in your open light." So I'm led by poets like Lorde, political prisoners. I'm really excited to hear about the news today. And the abolitionist movement scholars who confront what abolition teaches us about feeling ourselves beyond the conceits and comforts of capital. So to reiterate the question from my essay's abstract, we begin by asking, how might a Black Maroon's politics of care reorient to disorient the present trajectory of democratic development towards something else, right? So a different vision, a different horizon. And in order to break through the kind of constraints of the holds of the logics that shape our imaginations of the future, my practice begins with finding your feet, finding your feet on the earth, and beginning to understand what knowledge transcends from that relationality first, and putting that relationality at the center of our pedagogy. So the question asks, what freedoms might we find when we reprogram, deprogram, and get down, in the words of Janelle Monáe's Queen, with the willful vulnerability of radical traditions of Black and Indigenous care, when we rise to create abolitionist horizons of public safety, education, and freedom en masse. So thinking about the kindred sociality of anti-slavery and contemporary activist Maroon community building in the context of Brazil, Christine Ann Smith enlightens us to the practice of quilombos. Quilombos, and I don't speak Portuguese, so if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I apologize. Quilombos are simultaneously spaces of escape and refuge, and war encampment, Smith teaches. She says, for decades, Black Brazilian scholar activists have looked to the liberation model of the Quilombo for political inspiration. Quilombos are the physical spaces where enslaved Africans encamped to escape from bondage during the period of slavery and the contemporary communities of their descendants that still occupy these historic encampments. Yet in the Black radical tradition in Brazil, quilombos are not only physical spaces, but also the practice of finding refuge from the total condition of slavery, including those conditions that extend beyond the temporal boundaries of physical bondage, like racism and the erasure of Black history. Quilombos are not only physical and cultural spaces, but also transtemporal, transspatial spaces of Black liberation that Black people in Brazil have articulated in response to the conditions of subjugation. So, drawing from academic and poverty scholarship of Maroon, abolition, feminisms, past and present, we might think about present day abolition, prison abolition movements as the new Enlightenment, with fire this time, the unfinished work of 19th century Maroons and fugitive abolitionists, the ongoing reparative work of waking the dead, walking with ancestors, fighting to feel more haunted, fighting to feel more than haunted, more than hunted, more than humiliated, dispossessed, and abject, becoming more than possessive individualism could ever hope to contain. Prophetic praxis of Black, Brown, and Indigenous liberation are carried from generation to generation, burning hot enough in the flesh of earth to turn coal to jewels that quake and crack the foundation from below to invoke the poetics of Lord cited above. For Lord, like many of us who strive to teach liberation as a theory and a practice, classrooms become something more than spaces of intellectual consumption or mere contemplation. They become more spaces of protest and popular education, extensions of the Maroon formations, congregations, the public or secreted assembly of those, quote, teetering on the edge of invisibility, dis-ease, and insanity. The classroom is an alchemic catalyst for change, for us to build the kinds of futures so-called free people cannot yet know to yearn for, much less imagine. When contradictions are revealed, something new can enter the frame. Sometimes teaching feels like this, like exorcism, helping students notice how we learn, not just with our minds, but with our whole bodies. Feet first, on the ground, absorbing lessons we may or may not have chosen for ourselves, then creating the conditions that can support them in shredding what no longer serves, that the kinds of learning they notice they're missing. Lord called this pedagogy confrontation teaching. She not only taught future teachers, she also taught police officers wearing guns at John Jay the following year. We had cops and kids off the block in the same class, she said. I did the course in the same way I did all the others, which was learning as I went along, asking the hard questions, not knowing what was coming next. And so I'll stop there, but I think this kind of not knowing resonates with a kind of Dharma, a Buddhist understanding of knowledge formation, but it also resonates with a Maroon fugitive knowledge of survival beyond the kinds of survival that are offered under the conditions of containment, punishment, and slavery. And so we relating to each other, not just as captives, but as endless possibility is part of what I'm learning from the margins of the prophets that are speaking from spaces of captivity. And so I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you, Professor Syedullah. I mean, this has been really rich. I wrote a lot of notes, but I can't eat up any more time. I just want to throw out a couple comments and then open it up, your dialogue among yourselves and also with our people who are listening, who are also wanting to participate and contribute. It seems to me the radical traditions, become the nexus or the crossroads that we're seeking. And I'm wondering, given, the content in your 4 presentations, which were all very important, right? Like this, the colonial capitalism, the mutation into racial capitalism, the question of how we see gendered forms of labor. As Professor Krauthamer says, there are competing claims about intertwined or entwined, which again, Entwined comes from Akia de Barros Gomez, the Mystic Museum. Calmes talks about urban indigenous feminism, right? And the complexity of our families and their contributions, but also the trauma of just trying to bring us together. So I'm wondering if you want to discuss, and you don't have to because you got your own question, but what's in my mind is the abolitionism, the feminism, the scholarship, the pedagogy. If the communities do not want to be intertwined holistically, in terms of the majority, is there a radical tradition then that would allow slices of the community to merge and to create the kind of visions and analyses that you've offered us today? And now I will mute myself.
So I'm going to jump in if that's okay. I loved hearing everybody's presentations, and likewise have pages of notes here. And I don't have an answer to your question, Professor James, but it makes me think of two things. Kyle, you had a note on one of your slides, right, that said anti-colonial solidarity is, I wasn't able to write it down, everything, but it was like anti-colonial solidarity isn't natural or easy, was the last word, easy there. And that really stuck with me, of thinking, right, like what we're talking about is work, right? Like the kind of work that we have to do as scholars, as people, as community members. And it's challenging. And so that just really stuck with me, that phrase on your slide. And Jasmine, I have to say, I think you misspoke, but I think I liked and then corrected yourself, but I liked the misspeaking better when you said something like, we want to be more haunted. And I actually feel like, yeah, maybe we do want to be more haunted, right? Maybe we do need to actually feel the presence of the past, right? Of ancestors, not ancestors, but of the weight, feel the weight of the past more, in order to do that anti-colonial work. I'm not sure, but I also I liked the idea of being more haunted, and not trying to create something new, but to really look back while we're thinking about moving forward.
Thanks for that reflection and lifting up, because it came out exactly as it was supposed to, and then I tried to correct it. But I think that is exactly what's been happening in the classrooms this past couple of years. And one of the comments one of the students shared last week that your comment brings to mind is that, I think what they realize is that they're walking with their peers, but they're not necessarily walking with previous or future generations. Their sense of being in time is challenged by the kinds of media and conversation that they are a part of, that are, keeping younger generations in tension with each other on the level of discourse, as opposed to place or land, and then that solidarity becomes kind of impossible because the artificial barriers are so sedimented and entrenched. And so when they began to think about what time it was and how their moment is, built upon the gifts of and struggles of generations past, and the lessons learned, and the desires and dreams, they start to get a little bit more curious about what it means to be in solidarity, not just with people across lines of class and race, because that's kind of a script that they're familiar with, but being in solidarity with previous generations was something that they had not considered before. And so it does make me think that it begins small it begins in small ways with the communities that we can leverage ourselves into, and beginning to introduce this different practice of relationality that isn't based exactly, as Bogues said, on competition or domination, but on mutual survival.
I mean, I think in relationship to Professor James's question, the way I've been trying to think about it is that it is really through relationality, and and rather than overlapping histories, and then trying to think about, okay, let's then see if we can put together people for solidarity, or or call people for solidarity action and so on. But that if we think about these questions of relationality, that where there's no template, there's no kind of pre-existing form, but it has to be worked through, and this is why it has to be worked through towards freedom. And it's the working through that becomes the actual key, which means that there will be difficulties, differences, quarrels, breakups, all sorts of things, messy things, as people try and work through a set of relations. Because I think in the end, the question is, how do we have a kind of common association where we live, but we actually live with different sets of histories, but even if sometimes those histories are common and complicated, and then how do we construct, and I want to use the two words very carefully, how do we construct a kind of democracy that is not an electoral democracy, but that in which people have voice, and speech within it, but with a certain kind of plurality, so that there's no one single narrative voice that says this is the truth and this is what you must do and so on. And those, though, to me, therefore, those are such a practices that one has to engage in on the ground and work through and quarrel through until we get to what do we like to put it, until we get to the other side of the River Jordan. Right? So to cross the River Jordan is one of the most fundamental, one of the most difficult things to actually do. And I mean, I appreciate the ideas of the 60s and so on. I myself being a kid, a high school student in that period, and growing up in the early 70s with all those things in my head and so on. But I also understand, I think, something which has happened, which is that the way in which neoliberalism, in this particular order of racial capitalism, has operated, is that it has actually created historical amnesia, around those kind of moments of quote unquote solidarity, let's put it that way, but B, it has constructed a set of categories of recognition and actually put people in competition in relation to each other about questions of recognition. And so that recognition then becomes a kind of misrecognition of a certain way in which we think about capitalism. So you read all the literature today, not all, you read a lot of literature today about secular colonialism and so on, and I quickly went through some of it again for today, and very few people ended up talking about capitalism. It's as if you are struggling against white supremacy, you're struggling against this, but you are not. But there's a society that has been constructed historically, and that has shaped all of us who live in it, and that we need to, with that society, we need to think about how to tackle. And so, I mean, I just want to make that point. But to me, the question is working through and relationality in relationship in answering Professor James's, partly answering Professor James's question.
Professor Mays, did you want to make a comment before I open it up?
Yes, just very quickly. I think one thing that I remember just kind of doing oral histories with family around, because I would ask them things like, what was activism like for you all back in the day in Detroit? And my aunt Judy responded to me that they used to either go straight from a native protest and then go right over to, say, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers or whatever sorts of particular forms of protest that they were doing, but they didn't see that as a form of competition. And so I'm glad Professor Bogues brought that up. It wasn't really a competition for them. It was simply that they were growing up in the sort of Black and Indigenous radical space, and they were educated and encouraged to struggle against all forms of issues with happening within their city. And is probably an exceptional and rare sort of occasion, but it has taught me a lot about not even whether or not you embody those things, but showing up. And that's what I always appreciated about Stokely and him showing up to a variety of Indigenous protests, because if you look at some of his earlier statements or even writings on like whether Black people had a future in relationship to land, he was kind of hesitant early on. And then he explicitly stated this is Indigenous people's land. And therefore, where do we go from there? Which I think it still remains a profound piece of history that has been essentially, I think, erased in many ways.
Thank you. It's open for the listeners, audience, anyone wants to contribute. I just want to echo something that's a puzzle in my mind, and I think it's in alignment with what Professor Bogues was saying. It seems to me that even around abolitionism, critiques of capitalism and imperialism disappear. So I'm wondering if things have been mystified, or is there a new language now that kind of veils some of the material struggles that were done historically? And as you say, Kyle, I'm calling you by your first name right now, okay? That people who went from one to another, demonstrations, we do it now like multiples, right? And there were connectors that were tangible, like the relationality, as Professor Bogues says. But then when I read the materials in the text, often that seems to disappear, as well as a strong critique of capitalism. But and feel free to raise questions among yourselves as I look in the Q&A and the chat.
Can I ask a question, and perhaps, and it's something I've been thinking and struggling through recently, but what are the ways also that notions of tribal sovereignty uphold capitalism or do not critique capitalism enough? It's something that amongst my peers and so forth, and a variety of communities I'm connected with, we often don't, and I understand the trepidation, but we don't really leap that. I mean, Indigenous nations are not immune to neoliberalism either.
I think it also links back to a question I had for Bogues. In your presentation, Professor, you were saying that you were thinking about freedom beyond domination. Let me see what it said. That distinguishes itself from both emancipation and liberation. And so I have a feeling that might have something to do with this politics of recognition and sovereignty claims in tribal nations as well.
I think we speak from a very limited experience, really very limited experience, where I think that there is a tribal sovereignty may be problematic in relationship to the imperial state itself. But at the same time, it is a necessary defense of the tribe. You see what I'm saying? So it to me, I think, and this is very limited, it works both ways. In other words, it recognized by the imperial state, secular state, means that you get certain things and so on and so forth. But you also, it is used as a way to defend for one's own self-defense, which I think is and a certain understanding of sovereignty, which I think is absolutely necessary. So it is a kind of, in my view, it's a kind of uneasy, relationship that exists. But then you are in the real world. This is the other thing. You're not in an imagined world. So you're in a real world, and you are in a world where people are trying to, after 400 years of of military things, of war and so on, and pacifications and genocide, are trying to find forms of organization and polity that will at least give them a certain sense of themselves and a certain sovereignty which has been stolen from them, and we know that history. So it's deep. So it is not in my view, and again, I want to emphasize a very limited view and limited experience. The sense I get, it is not unproblematic, and it's not a question of either. It is not that it is it works in the interest of the imperial state, or it doesn't work in it. It is much more complicated, I think, than that. And the relationship to the second question is, I just think that following on the African American and the Caribbean experience, Brazilian experience, is that emancipation is really a process that comes from above. You are emancipated, right? You are given, the dominant gives you, slave master, colonial, whoever, gives you the tools, or gives you emancipation, says you are emancipated, even if you have fought wars and so on and so forth, they say, okay, you are now free today. So, right? And that to me is emancipation. But liberation to me is about that you are liberated from something. You are, whatever that form is. So gender domination, racial oppression, etc., etc. Freedom for me, though, is another set of practices. Is the other set of practices. In other words, what I have stated is what I've said is that liberation for me becomes one ground from which you can begin to practice freedom. Okay, emancipation becomes deeply problematic because because emancipation is the ground for post-emancipation is typically set by those who have dominated you. So whether it is in the United States in the Reconstruction, which then eventually collapsed, or in the Caribbean in the post-1838, or in Brazil after 1888, wherever it is, in my view, this question that the ex-slaves then fight for freedom, but that because the ground is already shortened and already laid in a certain way, and the horizons of what you can do are already structured in a certain way, then you can't become full free. And you can begin to do practices of freedom. But what you then, one of the things that fascinate me, let me just cut it short. One of the things that fascinate me is how in many emancipated societies, post-abolition societies, there are revolts that people, oftentimes led by women, who ask the question, what kind of free is this? because the conditions that are supposed to be there for freedom are not really there. So from my work, I begin to think, okay, there are some distinctions here that we must begin to think about. I don't know if that answers you. So that therefore, for me, thinking about freedom is a much more complicated way, and is a set of practices that does not have a kind of normative sense to it. It has more a sense of the practice of, and it also has, it always, in my view, opens up a different horizon. And in those horizons, it is really trying to struggle against domination. We'll stop there.
So, we have a few minutes left. If I can pose another question, because there isn't one in the chat, just to follow up, one has been said. And I'm going to call you Barbara, if that's okay by now. So what Barbara was saying about being haunted, what's our North Star? I understand and I agree that we can't define freedom, but the haunting continues. And I remember a couple of months ago listening to Democracy Now! And was it 1,000, the number of environmental protectors who had been assassinated throughout the Americas, right? And disproportionately was going to be indigenous, which could be, Afro-Indigenous, Black, Indigenous. It was just the people who were protecting land, water, forest. And under those conditions where the quotidian, the everyday mundaneness, right, it exists. But there's also this other layer of a hyper-aggression from the state, which will now intrude into the womb, right? With the whole abortion, it's not even a retreat. It's really the totality control of reproduction. And then now it's a homicide, right? If you have an abortion or even take a pill, I guess we're going that direction with some states. Can you say anything about is there a North Star, even if we cannot define freedom, and how do we follow it when we're haunted?
Oh, wow. It's a beautiful question. That feels like a harrowing question. And actually, I think I'm now at the point of thinking about what Professor Bogues just said of freedom as a practice. So I'm not sure what the North Star is. When I think about being haunted and I think about, some of the individuals that I wrote about, there's a story that always comes back to mind of a man named Simon Harrison, who was enslaved in the Choctaw Nation. Missionaries purchase him and, give him his freedom, as it were. And he then embarks on this colonization venture to go to West Africa and become a missionary himself. And he writes these letters back to the States. And he says, when he got to the coast, I can't quite remember where he disembarked, probably Liberia somewhere. And he says, his heart just sank when he realized that he had to get on another boat and take another water journey. And all I could think about, and he's really evocative about the Middle Passage. And for me, all I could think about, right, is like, here's somebody whose quest for emancipation, right, that top down, was realized. And his life, though, was so completely wrapped up in colonization ventures, right, that he becomes acutely aware of this, right, that he's just been sent on another kind of Middle Passage back. And and for me, that's sort of the haunting, right, that there's no escape from this, right, that we have to so Jasmine, I like that, like thinking about being in solidarity with other generations, that there's no escape. And I think we shouldn't even be trying to escape, right? But it's only by embracing that haunting. I don't know, that's not so much of an answer, but that's at least what my thinking is these days.
Well, we've reached our time, and thank you. I mean, that helps me. I'm going to meditate on that. This has been, for me personally, it's been brilliant, and I'm sure others will share that. And thank you all for your contributions and your labor, and your thoughts that you shared today. We hope to see you again soon. Stay well.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be in community.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.